What's up everyone, this is Random Noise here today with another tutorial, and today I want to cover all the possible ways that you can connect your Korg Electribe to Ableton Live for recording, for using it as a MIDI instrument, syncing into Ableton. This is going to be a complete tutorial and we have a lot to cover. I'm going to go through all the different methods that you can actually connect and use the Electribe with Ableton Live. We're going to start with the basic stuff and then move on to the more advanced ways that you can connect the Electribe. And this tutorial is divided into the different chapters, so feel free to jump to any section that interests you. Starting with the audio connection, there are basically two ways to connect the Electribe to Ableton Live. You could either use the headphone jack or you could use the cleaner and more balanced stereo output, which I prefer to use because it's not clipping and it just sounds better when you're connecting that direct to the interface. From here, it's pretty straightforward, and you can see from this diagram, we're basically connecting the Electribe to the audio interface. And depends on what you have. I'm using here the Focusrite Scarlett 18i8. You just connect the balanced outputs to the inputs of the audio interface. The Scarlett 18i8 is a USB audio interface, so you can see here how it's connected and how does it shows up in the preferences inside of Ableton Live. So essentially, we have here the settings for both the input and outputs of the audio interface. Depend on what you're using, you will see different settings here and options. I have 8 input that I can choose from, and I'm using 2 stereo one to connect the Electribe to Ableton. So here we see how it looks like on the actual audio channel inside of Ableton Live. We have the external in, and then we selected the 2 stereo input that are connected to the Electribe. To be able to actually hear the signal coming in, you need to activate this button over here. This is basically the monitor. So if you want to hear the signal or basically monitor it, you got to make sure that this button here is activated to in. Once everything is set up like that, we can actually test out now the signal coming in from the Electribe. To actually record the signal that comes in from the Electribe, we got to make sure that the record button over here is enabled. And we need to activate the record here also in the transport bar. Start recording in Ableton and then start the sequence on the Korg Electribe. And you can actually start seeing the recording as a waveform inside in the channel. Now you will notice here that as soon as I stop the recording, the waveform looks like it's grayed out. And if I try actually to play back, I won't hear anything. The reason for that is because we activated the monitor button. So if we want to hear the actual recording, we need to disable the live monitoring and select over here on the channel the off button. Okay, let's talk about USB and MIDI, and this is where things becoming a bit more complicated, but it's actually quite simple. The easiest way to transfer MIDI between the Korg Electribe and Ableton is by using this USB on the left side of the Electribe that actually is sending MIDI in and out from Ableton and to Ableton. Now, once we connected the Electribe to the computer through USB, we will see in the MIDI preferences inside of Ableton two sections, one indicating the in and one indicating the out, which means MIDI out from the Electribe going to the MIDI in of Ableton, and MIDI out from Ableton going to the MIDI in of the Electribe. And all this information is being transferred through a single USB cable. Now we have a bunch of settings here, and I'm not going to cover everything in this tutorial, but let's start talking about the MIDI that comes out from Ableton and goes to the Electribe. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to focus on two selections, the track and the sync. Starting with the sync, basically what it means is that when we select this option, what we are saying is that we want to sync the Electribe to Ableton Live. So actually, Ableton Live is sending MIDI clock or the tempo to the Electribe. And instead of using the tempo on the Electribe itself, we are using the tempo from Ableton and are also able to start and stop the sequence on the Electribe from Ableton Live. But before we do that, we have to go to the Electribe first and change some of the settings. So heading over here to page 3 on the global menu on the Korg Electribe, we need to change the clock mode setting from internal to external USB, which basically tells the Electribe ignore my internal tempo and use the tempo inside of Ableton Live. So now I can go back here into Ableton and start the sequence from Ableton itself. And I can, of course, also change the tempo inside of Ableton Live and it will be reflected on the Korg Electribe sequence. Again, if you want to hear the recording, we need to disable the monitoring first. Moving on to the track option in the MIDI preferences, this is where we can use the Korg Electribe as a sound model and actually sequence or play the parts from Ableton. So MIDI notes or controls coming out from Ableton Live and going into the Korg Electribe. Now, very similar to what we saw with the audio channel, this is also reflected in the MIDI channel inside of Ableton Live. And here in the session view, I have a MIDI channel with the Korg Electribe selected. So I can send MIDI information to the Korg Electribe. As you can see from here, I'm controlling the first channel on the Electribe. Now, the way the Electribe is designed is that each part on the Electribe is using different MIDI channel. So overall, we have 16 MIDI channel, which means that if I want to use that kick over here, which is on channel 9 on the Electribe, I will need to go here to the drop down menu and select channel 9 first, and then I will be able to control that channel from the MIDI channel inside of Ableton Live. So now if I want to also control the snare drum, which is on channel 10 on the Electribe, I need to create a new MIDI channel inside of Ableton, have the same setting, so sending MIDI information to Electribe, and then selecting the channel that I want to use, which is number 10 here. One more thing that is important to mention at this point is that the USB cable is not transferring audio, only MIDI. So if we want to hear the actual sounds from the Electribe, we need to create an additional audio channel the way I have it here. So basically we have one channel for the audio signal and another MIDI channel to send the MIDI notes to the Electribe. Another thing that you got to make sure on the Korg Electribe on page 5 in the global menu is that you are not filtering any information that's coming through MIDI. This feature is designed to block any MIDI information that's coming into the Electribe. So we got to make sure that it's on the off setting here and it's not activated. If you are using Ableton Live Studio, the studio version, there is actually a much easier way to do all that and using only one channel to send and receive both MIDI and audio at the same time. And I'm going to create here another MIDI channel to show you how it works. So inside of the instrument folders, there is a plugin that calls external instrument. What it is, it's basically aggregating both MIDI and audio into one UI. So you can select here the same settings that we used to select before from the individual channel inside of one plugin, selecting both the MIDI out and the audio in. One caveat though is that this plugin is only good for monitoring the sound. If you actually want to record the sound, you will have to create an additional audio channel to capture the audio. But you can see from here that this is a very useful plugin because we have everything just in one UI without the need to create multiple channels. Another cool thing that you can use this plugin for, and again, it's only available if you have the studio version, is to use that to create a drum kit with the drum rack. So, as you saw before, we have to have one channel for each one of the sounds on the Electribe. But if you want to consolidate all the sounds into one drum kit, you can use this plugin in the drum rack to select the individual sound from the Electribe and have them all in one sequence. So here on the drum rack, I'm creating the first channel for the bass drum and then the second channel for the snare drum. So again, selecting the Electribe from the settings, and I'm going to rename the page just to make it easier to identify the different sounds. And this one will be the bass drum, which is on channel 9 in the current settings of my Electribe. And the second pad will be the snare drum, channel 10. And last one, for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to use the third pad to control the close hi-hat, which is on channel 13. And now I can play directly the sounds from the drum rack. Let's quickly name that one also to close hi-hat. So now in the sequencer inside of Ableton Live, I have all the separated drums inside of one track. So I don't need to use multiple channels if I just want to sequence a drum pattern. And if I want, I can select 16 pads on the drum rack and create a full drum kit that I can actually sequence from Ableton with the sounds from the Electribe. Okay, moving on to the final method in this tutorial. And this one will be about how you can use the sequencer on the Korg Electribe to control instruments inside of Ableton Live through MIDI. And for this, we are moving to the in section inside of the MIDI preferences inside of Ableton. Here, you got to select this option here on the track column. So basically, MIDI information that is coming from the Electribe going into Ableton Live. And if we are looking again at the MIDI channel inside of Ableton, this will be reflected in this area. So selecting where we're going to get the MIDI from and which channel. And I'm going to start by adding this simple piano sound from the Ableton instrument into this empty MIDI channel. On the Electribe, I gotta make sure that I'm changing the oscillator to use the audio in option. So when we are using the pad, it's not activating any sound and only sending MIDI information to Ableton to control the instrument. I also gotta make sure that I'm not filtering any MIDI information that is coming outside from the Electribe. So now I'm actually able to sequence the instrument inside of Ableton from the sequencer on the Electribe. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I usually upload this kind of tutorials and some of my jam sessions for electronic music on both hardware and software. Thanks again and see you next time.